Hello, welcome to the GC9X Post-Mortem. I'm Carl,
This is Snarbu.
and today we're joined by chiptune extraordinaire and all-around sexy cat, Nuteki.
Hello, folks.
Today we're going to be looking at Atomic Runner, developed by Data East. It was released in arcades in 1988, and then ported in 1992 to the Sega Mega Drive, followed by an additional port to the Japanese-only X6800 in 1993.
They were always a company that never seemed to have a very strong presence here in the US compared to Japan, at least in terms of facing the media. No one ever really talked about them other than people liked their games and they were noteworthy in the arcade and on consoles. They had been around since like 1976, but it'd be a while before they actually get into making arcade games. They're starting off working specifically as electronic engineering, so sort of building the cabinets, integrating interchangeable tapes inside arcade game devices. Naturally, over time, they phased this out because it's not particularly reliable technology for a machine that's being run over the course of an entire day that many people are pretty much beating on.
Basically the same problem Laserdiscs has.
Yeah, maybe even worse because, it's laserdiscs are still an analog medium and the disc isn't going to just break the way tape might or jam. Yeah, they managed to survive through 1983 and went on to develop a number of other games. Some of the ones that they've got down here on Wikipedia, they point out Burger King, RoboCop, the well-known Bad Dudes versus Dragon Ninja, Are You a Bad Enough Dude to Save the President, as well as Chelnov and Atomic Runner, which is the game we're focusing on today.
They made Karate Champ, which is one of the first fighting games ever made.
Mm-hmm.
It led to directly inspiring Way of the Exploding Fist and International Karate, and pretty much every fighting game from Europe in the mid to late 80s.
Man, Way of the Exploding Fist. That game lives up to its name because every time you punch somebody, it actually sounds like the guy's fist is exploding and he's just screaming in agony.
That's the whole reason I prefer International Karate. I just can't stand this. Ah! 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 Every single time either player attacks, you hear that coming through distorted speaker audio. It gets so old so fast.
It's kind of funny though. It'd be nice to have a button that you could just press at will. I have that way, and then you get bored and you never ever press it again.
Yeah. There are more games like with Boy's Blob having that hug button. More games just need a completely random scream button. One of the other things is that from 87 to 94, Data East, that is, were making a bunch of pinball games, a lot of which were based on licensed properties. And unfortunately, because of that fact, they tended to be really expensive to make because they were using these major licensed properties. And at the end of the day, a Guns N' Roses pinball game is not going to play all that much differently from Fight the Black Knight.
I'm wondering if all that came from their whole deal with, like, I don't know what the deal with this is, but they were featured very heavily in the RoboCop movie, or RoboCop 2, probably because they made the arcade game for RoboCop 2. So I'm wondering if that had something to do with it, but then I'm not sure how early their licensed pinball tables were coming out and how late RoboCop 2 came out, so...
Yeah. I think most of their successes came from a few licensed properties as well. So they thought, well, we'll make pinball with licensed properties. It was a really bad idea because, as you said, it doesn't really sell you anymore.
Yeah.
You're not engaging, because I can understand like a RoboCop game, you're engaging in the fantasy of being RoboCop. If you had a RoboCop pinball machine, you're playing pinball and there's a head of RoboCop looking at you the whole time.
Yeah.
You might actually spout out quotes, and the handle might be a gun or something, to launch the pinball.
Well, I do know that some of the better pinball machines have had licensed properties. I know the Terminator 2 pinball and the Twilight Zone pinball are very popular.
It's not a guarantee of success, but I guess if someone's willing to shell out the money for a specific license like that, they're probably willing to shell out a ton of money to actually make the pinball game worth playing.
That may have been Data East floor, because I don't know if they actually made the tables that good.
I've never really ever heard of Data East being mentioned in the same hushed tones as like Williams or Bally, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. They poured all their money into pinball, I believe, and then they didn't recover from that.
Yeah, they had to sell this factory to Sega in 1994, who, it should be noted, these days are making most of their money in pachinko.
That reminds me, though, Data East Pinball was actually responsible for the unreleased fighting game Tattoo Assassins. If you don't know what that is, just go look it up on YouTube, because there's videos of it, and it's really something special.
Oh man, Data East were the ones who poured all the money into that?
Yeah, so it was two guys, Bob Gale, the screenwriter for Back to the Future? What the hell is he doing involved with this game? Well, damn it, what the hell? Anyway, and Joe Kamenkow, or Kaming? I don't know how you pronounce his name. And he was the leader of Data East Pinball, now known as Stern Pinball.
Yeah, Stern Electronics or whatever were involved.
Yeah, they were basically what Data East's pinball division were when Data East purchased them, and then they became Data East Pinball. And I guess they must have, when they got spun off again, went back to their old name.
The Data East story ended in 2003, where they were completely dissolved and just had their licenses sold off to different companies.
Yeah, mostly like companies no one knows about that deal in mobile phone games.
That was the thing about Data East. It's like they're such a B tier.
Yeah,
It's-
everyone wanted their stuff.
Data East were famous enough that people wanted their stuff, but certainly not famous enough that they could keep themselves afloat with the same stuff.
Yeah.
They should have done like Burger Time remakes out the wazoo and just make one a cover shooter, like you're throwing like condiments at enemies, like you have like a mustard and ketchup gun, fighting like evil hot dogs, like the Earth has been taken over by sentient like food products. This is gonna sound incredibly stupid, but I always thought PO'd for the PlayStation and 3DO was a spin-off of Burger Time for some reason, because it starred a chef with a gun, and like, is this like some sort of bizarre like spin-off of Burger Time? It wasn't until years later that I found out that no, it's just its own weird thing. You're just a chef by sheer coincidence. Missed opportunity, though, I'll tell you that much.
Okay, so we're gonna start talking about the Sega Mega Drive and Genesis port that was released in 1992. We'll start off with the story, which is what the game starts off with. It's an incredible tale.
Here's the basic gist. You and your father are scientists, you know, you're doing scientist things. You know, you live all happily and peacefully. And then one day a bunch of aliens show up and just totally like murder the shit out of your dad and kidnap your sister. With your father's dying breath, he basically says, yeah, so there's been these aliens on this planet for a long time, and they claim that the Earth was actually, or they were on the Earth first, and they're called Deatharians. And I've known about this whole time and had you secretly working on the super-powered nuclear atomic running suit, just in case, you know, we ever had to kill them. So, yeah, I'm dying, so can you kindly go get the suit and do that, you know, like totally kill them?
Thanks, Dad.
And that's only the first half of the intro story, though. There's a second half to the story, and what happens is, okay, so you get the power suit, and then like the game's like, yeah, go run, like go and stop the aliens, atomic runner. Oh crap, you just got captured by him and been tortured for like the last however long. But then you get really mad and you break out, and then the game starts.
We also we mentioned Chelmy the daughter, right?
Yes.
Or
real quick.
his sister.
Yes,
His
sister.
She's just introduced as like, because she doesn't make sense, really. Like, you have to go help your sister. I was gonna save the world anyway, but now I have extra personal investment in saving the world.
It's not like they killed your dad or anything, so.
It's okay, you can just have one motivation, it's
Yeah.
alright.
Well, then he gets tortured too, so he's mad as hell and he's
Yeah,
not gonna take it anymore.
It's every Zack Snyder film trope at once.
I love that he gets tortured in his super suit. Like, we can't get him out of the suit. Just put him in the glowing dome of torture. That'll show him.
And just lock him up in the middle of where does the game actually start off? Because like you break out of this thing and you're like in this lava-filled like Mayan ruin sort of thing, and there's like pyramids in the background and like this temple sort of stuff.
Yeah, the lava pyramid temple factory.
Yeah.
/ laboratory, because that's always what I thought you started off in, was a laboratory. Because
Right.
What's great is like the beginning of the game is the like invasion. That's when they attack. How did they build all this crap?
Maybe you've been under for a really long time.
yeah, they don't actually specify how long you've been tortured for. It could have been 5 or 6 years for all we know.
That's so weird. I mean, there's a good reason why the game is the way it is, and we'll talk about that a little later. Without any context, and the game's not going to give you any context, really. It's just the most bizarre, like, piece of storytelling. Because even, like, all the backgrounds are really different.
It's like a world-spanning, globe-hopping adventure. Like, you start off in, like, some Mayan ruins, then you move on to, like, I don't know what sort of setting the second stage is in, and then it's, like, more sort of, like, South American ruins. Then
Egyptian,
it's, like,
Russian.
Yeah, and then finally you end up in New York somehow.
I like it how New York is completely undamaged.
Yeah, it looks like New York.
It's like, oh, the aliens invaded. I guess everyone just gave up and just left. Like, oh, fair enough. You were here first, apparently. What do we know? Okay, so in order to play this game, this is very weird. This one is technically placed in the genre of run and gun because you do both of those things. In fact, you're forced to do one of those things.
It's like auto-scrolling shmup platformer because you can actually Goomba stomp most enemies and bosses and such. If your feet touch an enemy, it'll kill them. But, you know, there again, the hit detection's kind of weird, so it's not quite a sure thing. It's like one of those
very
sort of...
important that you're in midair.
Yes.
If an enemy comes up from underneath you while you're on the ground, you do die.
Yes. It's not a sure thing.
To play the game, it's fairly simple, but it's a little bit confusing to wrap your head around. You've only got 3 buttons, because obviously it's a Genesis game. Default, the controls are A to shoot, B to jump, and C plus a direction in order to change Chelnov's facing angle.
That's the default controls in the western half of the world, essentially. PAL and US version both do that.
In Japan, the controls are much saner. I think it's still A to shoot, B to jump, but it's just press C to change direction, which is much more natural. Now, the reason you'd have to change direction is Chelnov is actually always running, and he can stop running briefly if you hold back on the control pad. He'll stop running, and then he will auto-fire at a significantly faster rate.
On the Genesis version.
Yeah, because of the way the auto-fire works, I assume.
There's no auto-fire in the arcade version.
Even if you do mash the button, you don't fire faster while running on the Genesis version.
Interesting little trade-off there.
On and off. I think that's one of the things that the Genesis version does a lot better. It feels like they actually took the time to look at the arcade release and balance it, which is really impressive. Because with most arcade releases, you got a very bare bones, very just take the arcade release, scale it back so it works on the system, then just throw a few credits at the player, and that's all that you need to do to get an arcade release in 1992. But they really went way further with Chelnov. Is there a port like it, 1988 to 1992? Is there a port that changes so much and improves the game this extent?
That I can think of that isn't a direct sequel? No, not really. This is kind of a unique early sort of remake of an already existing game. Like, you wouldn't normally see that until much later into the 90s.
On the note with the continues, there are actually 2 different amounts of continues you get, which I discovered because I had the European release. In the US and Japanese release, you can set up to 5 lives with a massive total of 15 continues. And
that's 75 lives total.
Yes, not counting, extra lives.
If it's your first run through, you probably won't finish it, even with that.
Even on easy, it's actually pretty difficult on easy.
How much easier is easier? Because I didn't try the difficulty settings.
I mean, the last time I played it on easy, and I want to say I got up to like stage 4 or 5. But after that, it's not a long game, but it can be a long game if you screw up a few times.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Even though the checkpoints are reasonably generous in this game.
But you lose all of your power-ups.
Yes, but then there's something else, a mechanic that I can't even think of many games that did this before it. If you lose, I think it's 4 lives in a row?
Yes.
The next power-up that drops will be a maximum power. Full damage, full range.
Full jump, too.
Full jump, and I think, because there's 3 power-ups, there's damage, range, I believe it's amount? Because there's
like
three.
how many there can be on screen, like rate of fire, basically.
Yeah, there's rate of fire, right? Because there's red, yellow, and blue. Red is power, yellow is range, blue is rate of fire.
Something like that, yes.
That sounds right.
In the European release, because all of the publishers hate Europe, the game defaults to 0 continues and 3 lives. Set a maximum of 5 lives with 5 continues, giving you 50 lives less than the US and Japanese release.
And you really need those 50 extra lives. You really, really do.
Now, one thing about this game is it's quite derisive. A lot of people don't like it, and I'm hesitant to always suggest this, but could they be playing the game wrong? Because this one, it looks like a run and gun. Everyone sort of describes it as a run and gun. It's often compared to its contemporaries like Contra, maybe Gunstar Heroes and stuff like that. But it's not, is it?
No.
It really is more like a shmup. I have no problem saying that at all.
There aren't too many games in this sort of weird genre, this weird hybrid of shmup and platformer. Basically Gradius if you had gravity and you couldn't move backwards, like you could stop moving forwards, but that's about it.
I like that it does use the run and gun mechanics occasionally. There's platforming challenges sometimes. There's a couple of bits where you have to bounce on enemies to get further in the level, otherwise you'll plummet to your death. Happens briefly in stage 1.
Yep. There are some like medallion-like obstacles that
Yes,
you have to jump over to cross the pit.
And that's one's great because it's a very quick early one, and it just demonstrates that you may have to do this.
Level 3 does it, and then level 5 or 6 and 7 do it.
The game lets you turn around, and it does frequently throw enemy patterns at you from the front and the back, which definitely is probably the game's cheapest aspect, is it can occasionally, and it does this a little more frequently the further you get, toss enemies from behind that if you're too close, you'll almost certainly get hit by them. There's a couple of points, I think it's level 4, is that the one with the pyramids?
Yes, that's Egypt.
There's a couple of points where they throw the bouncing rabbits, and occasionally they'll fall sort of out of the screen really fast to a spot on the map, and if you're not aware that they're going to come in, they'll probably just land on top of you without you being able to move away quickly. Because he does actually, for a guy named the Atomic Runner, he does move fairly slowly across the screen.
He does, yes.
So there's a few different power-ups. They're fairly well balanced, I guess. They do different things.
Yeah, there's a number of different weapons that you have access to. Like, you start off with the default laser weapon, which is actually really good. Like, you could probably beat the entire game with that. And then you have a bunch of other ones, too.
There's sort of a boomerang, which is, I think, one of the weaker weapons in the game, just because it's kind of limited in its range. It comes right back to you, and you can fire it in like either forward, diagonally, or sort of behind you. I mean, that's the same way all of the other weapons work. But because of the way it works, it only fires off in that direction, which doesn't give it much of an advantage over other weapons, because they all do that. So the lower rate of fire, and it stays going from where you are, so it makes it harder to get it to move across the screen the way you might want it to. You can't shoot upward and fire a range of bullets all across the screen as you.
I actually do like the boomerang. It actually does a decent amount of damage, and I don't know if it kills things on the backswing though.
Yeah, it should. The boomerang, and it's kind of the best weapon for jumping and spinning and attacking because of the way it arcs.
Oh, right.
Yeah,
that
you
is
do
a good
spin
point.
jump. Like, you can either jump straight up and down, or if you're holding any other direction, you spin around in a circle and fire off in all directions if you're holding the fire button down.
And the boomerang's best at doing that. It's still probably not the best weapon, but it's at its biggest advantage when you do that. Because Chelnov can only shoot directly in front of him, 45-degree angle, and that's it when he's on the ground. He cannot shoot straight up, which I think gets some people. The only way to shoot straight up is to do a jump and then spin, and then you can shoot like an 80-degree angle. It's
really
fixed.
weird.
But yeah, it's very specific the way he shoots. You know, it's very mechanical. I kind of like that. You know exactly where he's going to do everything because it doesn't change. The other weapons, there's the fireball, which is pretty good. Just kind of a wider attack than the laser. I think it might be a tiny bit weaker. You'd have to measure it against a boss. There's the sort of flail that just flies straight out and comes back.
Pretty
Does
terrible.
damage.
Like, even at full power, like, I don't know if it does like a crap ton of damage or something, because I can never really hold on to it long enough before dying.
The
But
only
it's
time that
really
I found a great use for it was when I was fighting the bird boss.
Oh,
It was kind of hard to hit the bird boss, but he could not touch you if you have this weapon, because the arc of the 3 flail hits, they'll completely cover you from the meteorites that he fires at you at the start, and then when he shoots those birds, they can't get through the flail again. You'll eventually wear him down. So it has like a minor advantage to it. Bosses do actually sort of have different vulnerabilities to different weapons, because some of them work well against bosses and some of them don't. I accidentally came up against the level 2 boss. He's actually really hard to take out with the boomerang, because you have to shoot the weak spot in his eye, and the hit box of the boomerang is this tiny like 1 pixel like dot on the boomerang. So it's really hard to line up his eye with the boomerang attack.
the laser, on the other hand, works perfectly. Because I guess they assumed you were going to die right before it, so.
Lasers are usually really good against all the bosses, actually, it seems like.
You've also got the like spinning bolas that go across the screen.
yeah.
I don't like them at all, because you can only fire like 2 at once.
You can fire up to 3, but they do so much damage, and it's technically 6, because it just sort of grinds into bosses. Like, you can beat the mini boss in stage 2, the weird dragon that pops up under the bridge, in just like a couple of seconds if you can just nail it just right.
That seems like that weapon's an anti-boss weapon, because it's kind of bad against the waves of minions that come at you.
Yeah, it has sort of a short range to it, but when you're in the close quarters with the bosses, it can make short work of almost all of them.
The other weapon is there's a homing missile, which is the explosion's very effective, but if you accidentally fire it at the wrong time, you might miss completely.
Yeah, it has a tendency also to home in stuff that doesn't actually get damaged either.
Yeah, it doesn't take damage.
I find that the game itself is really enjoyable. It's a punishing game because you die instantly, and that's in all versions. They took that straight from the arcade, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, there's no health bar in any version of the
No health bar and no shield. Nothing. You don't even get, there's not even an invulnerability power-up or something.
I mean, to me, it's fair enough because, you know, what do Contra and something like Gradius have in common? Both of them have one-hit kills.
You have to be a bit more preemptive, because it's not just, you're not just standing on a screen that you can move in all directions. Chelnov, you have a slow pace, and you're kind of a fat guy. Just in terms of your hitbox, because you don't have a tiny shunt box, get hit anywhere in Chenlov's body and you will die. Chelnov is actually quite a visually impressive game for 1992.
It is, yes.
It's even pretty visually impressive for even several years later. Maybe by 95 and 96 would be expecting something a little bit better, but even a lot of games from 1994 didn't look anywhere near as good as this.
Yeah, exactly. It's some of the best visuals on the system. Like, the closest thing I can compare it to, which I believe also came out in the same year, is Thunder Force 4. There's a very similar sort of weird sprite style that both of these games have, and it's just very nice and crisp looking.
It's that crispness, this is the sort of art that you get from the palette restrictions of the Genesis. There's a lot of black underlines, black outlines that sit on top of really bright, bold colors, because they have to use a few colors for everything, and everything is just silhouetted really nicely.
Yeah, that's one thing that I definitely think is true about the graphics, is that everything really pops out. So that's why it tends to look so detailed, is just because of how really well managed the color spaces are. There are a lot of games that may look a little bit more vivid when you play them in an emulator, but I think at the same time there's just a lot more thought that's been put into every color that's on screen in this game.
And also, in the Genesis release, there's no real sharing between the stages. They're all completely different in terms of visuals. I think there's not much overlap.
No, there isn't actually. I think only the enemies are recycled, and even some stages have unique enemies that only appear in that stage.
They all have their own unique song. I think some of the boss songs, are they always the same, the boss songs?
Yeah, the boss song is
Yeah.
the same until you get to the final boss, and then it has like 3 different songs,
Mhm.
depending on what stage of the fight it's at.
Yeah, the final boss in the arcade version has one song. It's different from the other boss songs, and it shows up in the Genesis version for the first form.
They've got the arcade songs in here. I think all the arcade songs are represented.
Well, there are
And
like
then-
2 that aren't. They're like stinger pieces, like the map theme and the title screen.
The music's great, it gets you really pumped. You don't feel any of the limitations, I think, of the Genesis in this game. Using most of its strength. There's not too many graphical tricks that you find in some of the later releases like Contra Hard Corps. And there's a lot of parallax in some of the stages. The opening stage with the lava volcano, I think that has like 5 or 6 layers of parallax.
It has
If you
quite a
check
few,
out
yes.
the lava, it's most of the other stages only have a couple of less layers. Then it gets. I wasn't super impressed with the Russian stage's snow effect because it was a very bland snow effect. It just sort of harshly graded across the screen. It didn't.
Yeah, that
Didn't
whole
blend with
stage
the
in
rest
terms
of
of
the game.
background wasn't super impressive. Like, there wasn't any parallax, I don't think, at all.
No,
There's
see, I
just
think
the
that they
snow.
must have spent the parallax budget for that stage on the snow. I think it's definitely noticeable because the stage no longer moves. Because obviously the game looks really good when he's running because the background feels alive. And then you get to the Russian stage and it's a very flat background. It feels a lot more in place with like a PC. Does anyone have anything else with the Genesis release?
I do want to note something about the final boss battle. Besides it having like more stages, there's this funny little thing where like you'll enter the boss chamber and there's this guy on this podium like praying to the final boss, and then he quickly pulls out like a gun and starts shooting at you. I don't know if it can actually kill you. I haven't tried, but he goes down in one hit and like bursts into flames, and it's just like the funniest intro to a boss fight I've seen because like. This guy's totally trying to kill you, and he can't do anything about it.
Feels like they were trying to establish that, Chelnov in his super suit are like super powerful, which makes sense. But the whole game, you die in one hit. It's like it waits until the very last boss of the whole game to pit you against someone who's clearly unable to combat you. It's a bit late to establish Chelnov as this powerhouse.
Well, obviously the deaths aren't canon, so...
He might not die. He just sort of wigs out, right?
Yeah, he does a little
Yeah.
very jig, and then he just like he screams, and then he just falls over like he just had a heart attack. It is the absolute most merriest jig I've ever seen, like death jig I've ever seen. It's like he's just tapping one out that he dies.
Yep.
You don't lose more than like 20 seconds ever. Like at most when you die. I mean, that's true of the arcade release as well, I think, which was nice.
Yeah, there are a lot of checkpoints in this game.
It's almost like someone knew that you were going to die over and over again, and they wanted to be fair.
I think if there's one problem about the checkpoints is that there's no signifier that you've crossed one when you have.
So thus far, we've been talking about the Genesis release, and this was actually the second release of the game. We're going to look at Atomic Runner Chelnov for the arcade. This game was actually incredibly controversial. Why would the game that we've been talking about ever have been controversial?
Well, the whole atomic thing, maybe the whole Chernobyl disaster, Chelnov, Chernobyl. Some slight similarities there.
The story was actually changed for the Genesis release, and that was really big reason that the characters and the plot of the Genesis release are completely insane, because the original framework is a little different.
It's no less insane, though, honestly.
It's insane in a slightly different way.
And it's certainly hard to follow because you can't actually read the introductory text in the arcade version in any reasonable length of time. Not as little time as they actually give you to read it. It's like half a second, boom, hopefully you read that page of text.
The Chernobyl disaster happened in April 26, 1986. That was the Chernobyl disaster. The arcade release of Chelnov was 1988. In it, Chelnov is a coal miner who is caught in a nuclear accident. Chelnov gets superpowers for some reason. It doesn't explain where he got the suit either, does it? It's just sort of...
I assume the suit was actually what he was given to him by they're called something else in the arcade version, Detanians or something. I think it's supposed to be Deatharians, but it's Detanians or something really weird. I assume the suit is actually to contain his powers, because in the intro, like if you look real close, he's actually shooting out the beams uncontrollably from his hands, like energy
Yeah,
beams.
he's like Cyclops.
Yes, except all over. So
What happens if the guy just punches down the door and it's like, you will help us be evil? He's just like, nah. Then that's it. He fights them.
yeah, there's like he chose not to use his powers for the evil of the whatever the hell they are, and they lock him up, and he eventually escapes.
And he escapes into hell, apparently.
Is that really where he ends up? As hell?
I don't know. It's a nightmare. It's like drawbridges and castle stuff, but everything's mutated, and there's zombie hands trying to tear him apart. There's like the creepy purple men in the background in like stage 2, ominously floating in the background.
I mean, the one complaint I have against it is that the aesthetic, and this is it's not the only game that I've played that has this problem. It reminds me a little of Shinobi, which was a couple years earlier, and all of the effects have just this sort of really flat kind of shading to it. Nothing really stands out like it does in the Genesis version. All the colors are usually really similar, and it means nothing can stand out visually very well.
It's very muted and drab.
Muted, yes.
Because like the backgrounds for the most part are a mix of generic tiling and black. It makes the game feel a bit more mysterious, but it's definitely not eye-catching. Some people like to point out that the animation on Chelnov is quite impressive, and I guess it is for 1988, even though the actual quality of the art is kind of lower in general.
Yeah, it's pretty nasty looking.
There's not as much detail, and I get sort of a sense of there almost being empty space, probably because there's only a single layer, and not two like you have sort of forced on you by the Genesis.
So besides the visuals and the audio, actually we haven't mentioned the audio. Like, there's less music in the arcade version in general, right? Like, there's the main theme, there's like another theme, there's like another theme, and then they just kind of cycle through all of those, don't they?
Yeah, they only use the second theme for 2 stages, and as you pointed out, I believe they're only stage 3 and stage 7. They're sort of notable because they're the 2 city stages in the game.
There's only like 3 tile sets. I think the opening level is different to the others, right?
Sort of. It's really weird. Like, I don't know. It's just weird.
The opening stage, and then there's the indoor stages with the purple men, and then there's the city stages. And I think there's some variation between them. There's definitely not nearly the amount of the Genesis release. Even the levels kind of blur together a bit. They use very similar colors in all the stages. There's
Lots of purple.
Yeah, it's a really purple game. It's a lot harder to get behind the arcade release. 1988. Was this a decent looking game? Because I don't know. It seems like it was okay.
Yeah,
it's
this
probably
is probably
average.
Okay. Like, you get people playing it. I mean, there'd definitely be worse looking stuff out there. Because, you get like a game from 85 or 86, it's probably still going to be there at this point. But, at the same time, compare this to, like we're saying, to Shinobi, which looks similar but a little bit better, and, say, Outrun or Space Harrier, which have already come out by now.
Kind of looks like an early Amiga game in a lot of ways. It's very unusual for an arcade game.
Yeah, I can see that. Some people have also compared it visually to Prince of Persia, which I can also see. Just the amount of sort of black empty space and brick tiles. Yeah, the only thing that stands out is, I think, some of the bosses are okay. Because they actually did put a similar amount of effort into the bosses as they did in later releases of the game.
Yeah, they're all pretty interesting looking.
Yeah, the bosses didn't change in their appearance quite as much, I think, between the 2 versions compared to almost anything else.
Yeah, because they changed, like, the Deatharians in the Genesis release are like they like have floating Spider-Men, like the spiders with faces sort of thing going on. Whereas in the arcade release, they're just like small round orbs with helicopter blades, aren't they?
Yeah, they're just little robots.
They don't look nearly as menacing, which is like, on the one hand, sort of makes sense considering they're supposed to be carrying power-ups. It is, when you look at it, maybe just a little bit dissonant, I guess, because it's like these weird skeleton spider thingies are helping you.
Maybe they're actually trying to bring those power-ups to soldiers on the front line, and then you just kill them too quickly.
Well, that would make sense too.
You gotta wonder why enemies would manufacture power-ups for you to use.
Yeah.
Yeah, they do carry, in both versions of the game, they do carry turrets later on
Yeah, they do.
that actually shoot at you, so they're not completely non-hostile, but they don't start very hostile.
I mean, if you touch one of them directly, they will also kill you. Just like anything else, but
Yeah, well, everything's gonna kill you. I
Yeah.
guess. It's fair enough.
everything kills.
It's kind of like that book, Everybody Poops, only it's like everything kills you.
Well, I couldn't help but think of No One Can Stop Mr. Domino when I was playing Atomic War. Just for the fact that they're both characters who run non-stop, and both of them get killed by anything. Just every time, you're walking along and just you get curved by anything, you die. You can jump on things though, I mean that's always an advantage.
You can
That's
still
one
do that
thing
in the
you can't
arcade
do
release
on-
too, can't you?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes,
because
that's-
there are a bunch of places where you need to in both games.
Yeah, that's the thing. There's very little changed gameplay-wise. That's the really unusual thing between these two ports, is they look so different, but in the actual underlying game, they didn't change a lot. You still jump on things. The hit detection is kind of off in the arcade release, especially with the Dogo, the boss in the second stage, and fourth stage? I can't quite remember which stage he's the boss in as well.
Yeah, he's on stages 2 and 4, oddly, in both versions.
The thing is, in the arcade release, I sometimes had, I died a bunch of times trying to jump on his shoulder, whereas on the Genesis release, you can jump on any part of his head pretty much with no risk.
Although you did say that boss had an extra attack in the Genesis version.
Yeah,
I couldn't get up that far in the arcade version, so...
Okay, well, actually, a lot of the bosses have been tweaked up for the Genesis release, which is bizarre, because the arcade release starts out much easier than the Genesis release, but then rapidly becomes much harder. They make it harder by throwing... Generally, there's a couple more enemies, or the enemies are more aggressive with their projectile use, and that gets very hard in Chelnov, because when they start shooting, that's the hardest thing in the game to dodge, is enemies that when they shoot. Because the moment you're in the air, you have to land again, and then there's an enemy that's shot where you're moving, and then you die. And
Right. And you only have so much mobility. You can't really so much move backward as you can just stop in place.
Yeah, that's probably the biggest, most frustrating element of the game overall, is when you do something, you sort of are committed to it. So what invariably happens is when you press jump, if an enemy runs in and fires a bullet at you, you're in a lot of trouble because you're not going to be able to move anywhere to avoid that bullet. And most of the stuff in the game, lots of things take more damage to sort of get rid of. The drills are take twice as many hits to bring down in the arcade release. It's incredibly infuriating.
And there's no auto fire.
You have to mash the buttons as fast as you can. So lots of things are just kind of more frustrating. In the bits where you have to cross areas by jumping, there's less platforms. It's really strict about making sure that you jump as well as you can. So that can get, not in the first level, but in the later levels. The difference in the bosses, it's kind of probably one of the more interesting changes. In the Genesis release, for instance, the Doju, whatever, he jumps around and then he fires things out of his head. He doesn't fire out of his head nearly as frequently, or really at all, in the arcade release. It doesn't feel like he shoots very often, like half as much if he does. And then when he loses his head in his second fight, I don't think it shoots. Or if it does, again, it doesn't shoot very much, so it's an incredibly easy fight to get through because you just stand there and shoot at the head for a couple of seconds. There's a couple of other differences with most of the bosses. The troop aircraft thing, that doesn't have its homing rockets, and it also can't kill you when it crashes. So it goes from being a very tough boss to an incredibly easy boss. The last boss might be slightly easier in the arcade release.
It has fewer stages, so yeah. It's slightly easier in that respect, because part of the problem with the final boss in the Genesis version, at least the second stage of it, because first he's embedded in a wall, you need to hit a weak point, and then he's up walking around. The way he walks is completely unpredictable. I have never managed to figure out exactly how the final boss in the Genesis version moves around once he starts walking. Because sometimes it seems like he'll just charge you and you die and you can't do anything, and then other times he'll actually back up and you can actually hit him. It's really weird.
The last boss in the arcade release is Alien. Isn't that great? It's Alien with a sword. It's gonna fuck you up.
And no legs, just floats around.
Yeah.
Also, his head
yeah.
opens up and spits out like tinier versions of him or something. Bullets, I don't remember. It's something ridiculous.
That's a great boss. I like that boss. They had to change it for the home release. Maybe they didn't want to get sued, or maybe they just wanted to make something visually more interesting. But it was so funny that it's just Alien with no legs flying around. And you fight him on the Statue of Liberty, too.
Yeah, I don't know. I have no idea what the deal with the final stage in either version is, because it's like, you go from Russia in the Genesis version to New York somehow, and then in the arcade version, I don't know where the hell you are until you get to New York, and then it's like, okay.
You're, like, everywhere. You're in Techno Egypt, Techno Mexico, Techno Russia, Techno Underground somewhere, I guess.
Yeah, that's really nice. I love those stages.
Yeah,
arcade doesn't have those. It's a big negative.
Yeah.
Hugely negative.
It's just like, I don't know. I have no
Underground.
clue where you're supposed to be in the arcade version.
See, I
In a
thought
mine.
that maybe you're supposed to be running through grossly irradiated, destroyed Chernobyl. There's no evidence to support that, so I don't think it's true. Given the nature of the game's backstory, I'm not quite sure what their explanation is. I do know that Data East claim that it's not about Chernobyl and that it's a coincidence because Chelnov is supposed to be related to Karnov, which isn't exactly completely believable. And to follow that up, they also claim that they had already, concepted the game out, and it's just a coincidence that Chernobyl happened, even though there was a 1.5 year gap between Chernobyl and the game's release. So again, I don't think it's particularly believable.
They also changed the story later, so...
Yeah, they didn't stick to their guns on this. They went,
Right.
let's change it, so... Whatever, I don't think... You're not going to be offended if you boot the game up today. It's dumb. It's a very dumb plot.
Yeah,
It's
but
stupid.
there's definitely a sense where you can see why it's sort of a bad idea, like having a game that got put out in 2003 in which a couple large buildings collapse, for example, might be a little too on the nose.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's okay. I mean, I don't even know if you'd bother playing the arcade release very much. Like, you're not going to miss out on much. It's not as well balanced. They really refined the gameplay, even though it's not too different. All the changes they made seem to have been very deliberate and generally to make the game more fun or more playable. The biggest change, though, they've got a couple of things. The way the weapons work in the arcade release is a little different. Your basic laser is really bad, whereas in the Genesis release, by default, it shoots... Is it 2/3 or 3/4 of the screen? I think it burns out eventually.
Yeah, it gets pretty close to the end of the screen, though, and if you're standing more or less in the middle of the screen, you should be able to hit to the end of it, I think.
Whereas in the arcade release, you can fire about a
I wanna-
quarter, a third of the
Yeah, I want to
screen.
say a third as well.
That's the distance you fire by default, and the range upgrade takes it to 2/3 and then full screen, basically.
Yeah, I was having between that and the lack of autofire. I tried playing the arcade version. I just couldn't get into it. I've seen long plays before, but I'd much rather just stick with the Genesis version on this one.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, the weapons. There is one change to the weapons, and it's a shame they changed this because it's actually kind of cool. The flail weapon is much cooler in the arcade version.
Yeah, it's like this huge tri-flail thing. It just shoots out really far, and it's just ridiculous. It's a ridiculous weapon.
I think the chain does damage too. I'm not sure.
Yeah,
if
the
it
chain does damage as
Genesis
well.
version.
It's a very cool weapon, but it's definitely not worth it. So I'm gonna get recommendations. Would you suggest that they try and play it?
I actually would. I think it's a very good game, and while there are a lot of people who detract from it on the internet, even just visually to look at it, you crank the continue count all the way and you just see how far you can get. It's totally worth it because I honestly think the environments they created for the Genesis version are really worth exploring.
If you're very interested in sprite art, it's hugely impressive in terms of backgrounds and just the way it generally handles itself. It's a great looking game. You can use save states today if you want, so it's not going to be too punishing. I really enjoyed it. I didn't play this game when I was a kid. It's going to take at least a few lives, maybe a couple of continues to get used to the way the system works. And if you pick up the European or English US release, make sure you change the control scheme to something that suits your liking.
Yeah, it's such a weird thing to do rather than just have C turn you around at all. It means you can't really turn around in place exactly, because you have to be moving backward in order to turn around.
I have no idea why they even had that control scheme in the first place.
Yeah.
So they invented a control scheme for the English-speaking release, and it was the worst control scheme, and they made it the default.
Yeah, I would strongly advise turning that off as well. Another thing I'd advise is, in the event you find that you do not actually like how the game plays, I still think it's worth checking out. And the whole reason I decided that I felt the game was worth playing in the first place was because I watched the Game Center CX episode of this. Really gets to show you most of the really creative environment art, and you don't actually have to play through it yourself. If you don't get up to like the 4th level, you can just marvel at how the boss of that stage drains away his lives over and over again. I mean, the game is hard, but because there are a lot of checkpoints and the bosses usually don't take too long to beat, it's not like after you die you'll feel like you've wasted a ton of time on whatever killed you. So it's easy to say, oh, I'll get right back in and probably beat it this time. And honestly, if that's what you're going in thinking, you're probably going to be right.
Yeah, and obviously the Genesis release, not the arcade, this is very important. Genesis release, you die a few times, the game starts giving you a pity power-up. It's basically the Golden Tanuki equivalent. You'll take that power-up, and you'll thank them for it.
Mm-hmm.
Just play it because it's batshit crazy. Just seriously, just sit down, just read the ridiculous story and just like totally go with it, because it's that sort of weird insanity you don't see in a lot of modern games. Like, I'm sure if they did a modern version of it, it would be taken a little too seriously, rather than, you're just this crazy guy in an atomic powered jogging suit who has to kill aliens that are called Deatharians.
I'm pretty sure that we'd all recommend the game, Uteki. I'm gonna ask you first. I'm going to get you to give this game a contemporary score, so a game compared to the other games available at the time when it came out. And I'm also going to get you to give it a modern score. And the modern score doesn't have to strictly be, compared directly to, say, I don't have to say, well, compared to God of War, it's not very good. But just in terms of a modern context, what would it be worth? I'm gonna say just the Genesis release.
I guess my sort of point of comparison for this, I mean, I am tempted to say Contra on this, just because Contra is batshit at times as well. Contra's all over the place, and there are all sorts of just bizarre enemies that you have to deal with over the course of the game, with somewhat erratic but mostly predictable and fixed patterns. So, if you like run and guns, it's definitely worth checking out, with the note that it's not gonna play exactly like Contra. And
would you recommend it for someone who doesn't like run and guns?
Maybe.
But likes jumps.
Yeah. Actually, I think I would, because compared to Contra, there's less stuff going on screen at any one time. There's a little bit more thought of how you've got to get through a couple of these obstacles, timing and, space management, in a way that's present in Contra but focused on in a different way. For a sort of modern score, when it comes right down to it, you look at something like, say, that the newer Rayman games, and there's a lot of auto-scrolling in there. There's a lot of shoot-'em-up influences. There's a lot of very pretty but much more strictly cartoony, like, sprite and artwork. And in a lot of ways, it's the sort of game that, if you like, I can see you enjoying Chelnov. Because it's also pretty difficult, it's visually extremely interesting, and there's just all kinds of crazy stuff going on.
So yeah, if it's to your tastes, you should definitely expect to like it.
For a game in 1992, I would give it probably an 8.5 out of 10. It's very good, but it's definitely hard to get the hang of. And for a game nowadays, I think I'd be quite happy giving it a 7 out of 10. Partly because I like giving 7 out of 10 to everything, and also because, you know, there's lots of runner-type games nowadays. There's the bid.trip stuff, there's Run Man Race Against the World. There is a point where if you do not like Contra, that you probably won't like. If you don't like even the basic idea of Contra, you probably won't like this game. So, you know, with all of these run and guns, or all of these running types of games that aren't so focused on the shooting aspects, you know, if it's specifically the using a gun that turns you off, then you're probably going to want to play those instead.
He scored it exactly how I would, although I would give it an 8 out of 10. For a contemporary game of the era, it was pretty solid. It looks great, sounds great. But as noted earlier, it takes a while to get used to. Like, this is a game I rented a lot as a child, and I could maybe make it up to like the 3rd or 4th stage. Wasn't really able to get much further until I was an adult, so it takes some getting used to. So that might be an initial turn off to the game. But if you stick with it, it's gonna deliver. Modern score, as Muteki noted, there's a lot more games like this now. I don't know if I would recommend Atomic Runner over any of the newer Rayman games or even Bit Trip Run or any of those, but if you're looking for sort of an old school arcade game, you know, it's still pretty solid, it still holds up, still fun to play. So
I think that I would actually have been tempted to give it something close to a 9 for a contemporary game. I just really struggle to think of a game that, because I'm comparing it in the sense that in terms of replayability, in terms of the amount of sort of bang for your buck you're going to get out of it, I feel like this is a game that you could return to over and over from, you know, 92. You could play it again and again, all the way to the end of the Genesis lifespan. This would have been a great game to have. If you got into it, it would have been a great game to play. And I feel like just being so distinct and getting so much right in terms of its design, that it's just such a strong game. A more modern context, I'm definitely closer to you guys in around a 7. I can't think of a game offhand before or since this that feels pretty much exactly like it.
Oh yeah, I mean even the sort of games that I'm approximating it with that I've seen more recently, like when I'm mentioning Run Man and such. The games really don't play all that much like each other. It's hard to give a good point of comparison because, you know, there really isn't all that much that. I mean, I could argue that it's to games like Contra and Gladius what Turrican is to Metroid and Bionic Commando. It's difficult to look at the game in terms of its constituent parts because it's necessary to understand how the components work together in order to understand why the game is worth playing.
It is a very distinctive flavor, and the fact that its sound and visuals are also almost timeless. They're definitely they're always going to be at least good enough.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the only real hazard you have is it was kind of difficult to get into when it came out, and that's not going to improve with time.
No.
It's a tough little one to get to, but I think it's a very, very rewarding game if you can sit through it, because you're not going to find anything like it, and you probably have a good time. Try not to get too angry at it, because it's going to cheap hit you occasionally.
Yeah. Nowhere near as bad as in the arcade version, at least, I felt, but...
Having played the arcade version, having played the home console version, I genuinely think you should just avoid the arcade version.
Yeah.
Okay, well that's the end of this post-mortem. I feel we had a good time, and if you had a good time, we'd love to hear from you in the comments, and make sure you subscribe to us, otherwise we're not going to get any hits, and we're all going to die in a fire. especially Snob Boom, because
Oh.
I'm going to burn his house to the ground with him in it. And if you have any suggestions for games that you'd like us to dissect, let us know. And be sure to follow GC9X on Twitter, along with myself. And you can also follow Muteki, and those will be available in the links below the video.
During the credits sequence, Chelnov gets attacked by a giant airship, and he goes through his death animation. The game sort of fades out for a bit, and then we see him on a beach with his sister Chelmy and a whole bunch of other people that it's implied that he's rescued. But on the other hand, is he alive, or did he just die?
Because there's never a beach in the game. It's a completely unique background they created specifically for this. And it's keeping in mind that he died in New York. There's no beaches like this in New York.
Well, he did go from Russia to New York in like a single bound, so it's hard to say. Maybe he has nuclear-powered death swimming. I don't know.
Yeah, he was. Who knows? It's a great ending, because this is a great kind of ending that these video games have, where they just, you win, probably. Congratulations.
Nihilistic victory.